I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest updates from the front lines, discuss financial support for Ukraine from the EU and America, and I interview Ukrainian journalist Inna Gadzynska about her work tracking Ukrainian artefacts and treasures that end up in Russian museums.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 14th of November, 1 year and 263 days since the full-scale invasion began. And joining me today are Assistant Comment Editor Francis Sternley and former tank commander and Telegraph contributor Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started by going through the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start in Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelensky has said Russian attacks are increasing across the front line. The military reported an increase in the number of enemy assaults, Mr. Zelensky said in a post on Telegram, saying Russians were attacking near the cities of Donetsk, Kupiansk and Avdiivka. This comes as Mr. Zelensky's government pushes the West to increase military supplies as winter approaches. As well as heavy fighting across the front, 3 Ukrainian civilians have died and 19 have been injured in Russian attacks over the past 24 hours. Heavy shelling in the Kherson Oblast killed 3 people and injured 14 adults and 1 child. That's from Governor Alexander Pokudin. Ihor Moroz, acting governor of the Donetsk Oblast, said 2 civilians were wounded in Avdiivka and another was injured in a village outside Marinka. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, artillery shelling injured a 42-year-old man and damaged homes, a gas pipeline and a power line. As we know, Russian troops abandoned Kherson and the west bank of the Dnieper River in the region last year, but regularly shell those areas from positions on the eastern bank. And in a separate message, the governor said that a hospital in the city was shelled by Russians, and earlier on Monday, a car was shot at in a suburb of Kherson, killing 1 person and wounding a 2-month-old infant and his mother. In Russia, independent news outlet Medusa reported that a Ukrainian drone struck an explosives and munitions factory in Russia overnight, but failed to explode. They said that there were no casualties after the drone broke through the roof of the plant in Seltso, a village in the Bryansk region that borders northern Ukraine. Elsewhere, Russia claimed to have shot down a Ukrainian drone flying over the Moscow region overnight. This is from the Defense Ministry, who went on to say that it was one of 4 drones destroyed over the country last night. The other 3 were shot down in Tambov, Orlov and Bryansk regions. Just some interesting news on Russian equipment, an analysis coming out of Britain's MOD, which speaks to some of the complexities both sides are facing staying supplied with enough missiles and munitions. The British MOD in their daily update write that Russia is increasing its production of a laser-guided artillery round after, quote, After failing to make enough conventional munitions, the MOD said the Russian army has, quote, already achieved success in the war using the 152mm Krasnopol M2 rounds, but with winter conditions now coming into play, they will, quote, likely attempt to improve the munition because low cloud is its Achilles heel. And I know Hamish will want to speak a bit about this later on, but just to finish with the MOD's analysis, they write that as winter weather closes in, it is likely that Russia's access to improved precision munitions will be one of the key factors in its operational performance in Ukraine. From the ISW, moving on, that's the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, we heard an interesting take on the retraction of Russian state media reports that Dom reported on yesterday. So if you remember, on Monday, 2 state media outlets issued retractions within minutes after announcing a retreat to a, quote, more favourable position for Russian forces in the Kherson sector. It's worth noting at this point that Ukraine has said that its army has not observed any such withdrawal. Now, the ISW have looked at this and they've written, quote, the now retracted reports of a Russian regrouping on the east bank of Kherson Oblast may be indicative of actual discussions taking place in the high echelons of Russian military command that may have prematurely entered the information space before being officially released, but they also say that Russia may have leaked this news to dupe Ukraine into underestimating its strength. So they say the Russian military command may have instructed state media to release and then retract these reports as part of an information operation that aims to have Ukrainian forces underestimate available Russian manpower on the east bank of Kherson Oblast. That's from the ISW. Back to Ukraine, where the Defence Ministry has denied reports it is planning to sack 3 army chiefs in what would be a fresh cull of the military's top brass. This comes after Ukrainian newspapers reported that Defence Minister Rustem Umerov was preparing to sack Lieutenant General Serhiy Nayev, that's the Joint Forces commander, Major General Tatiana Ostashchenko, commander of the Medical Forces, and Brigadier General Alexander Tarnavsky, who leads the Southern Tavria Group. The Ukrainian Defence Ministry issued a statement later saying information published by a number of media outlets is not true, although it did not specify which media reports it was referring to. This all comes as reported tensions between the country's political leadership and the military have intensified. Finally, just staying with some analysis from the ISW, they've been picking up on how sources on the ground are dealing with the changing weather conditions as we head into winter. They write that the Ukrainian and Russian sources noted that weather conditions are impacting the battle space, but crucially not halting operations. They're reporting that they're hearing that rain and mud in Donbass is impeding the speed of ground maneuver, that fog and rain complicate both Russian and Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance efforts and lead to reduced numbers of attacks, and that falling leaves complicate efforts to hide equipment and personnel. In the south, Russian aviation has been less active due to weather conditions, and that Russian forces are attempting to launch as many glide bombs as possible with each sortie. According to the ISW, one Ukrainian reserve officer assessed that mud will make many roads near Avdiivka impassable, complicating logistics for both sides. On the Russian side, Russian mill bloggers have claimed that recent heavy rains have led to reduced shelling, and that strong winds and rain interfere with Russian drone operations and, again, complicate offensive operations in western Zaporizhia Oblast. Russian sources have also circulated footage purporting to show mud and rain-filled Ukrainian trenches. So, what's their conclusion? Well, the ISW continue to assess that autumnal weather conditions will decrease the tempo of Russian and Ukrainian operations, but not halt them entirely, and that fighting will continue on both sides throughout the winter months. They note that it did last year and in the years between 2014 and 2022. Well, those are all the military updates, I believe. Francis, can I hand over to you for the politics and diplomatic sections?
Sure. Well, thanks, David. Sorry if it's a bit more scattergun than usual today. Dom and I just had a very interesting conversation with a senior Western official here at Telegraph Towers. I can't say who it was just yet, but we've discussed them and their work on the podcast many, many times. So hopefully we'll be able to reveal that to you in due course. Now, obviously, as you discussed on the podcast yesterday, this is a really significant moment in British politics, with David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, becoming our new Foreign Secretary. Something notable for lots of reasons, not least because he's not a member of Parliament, first of all, so he's had to have a peerage put on him post-haste so that he can sit in the House of Lords and therefore Cabinet. But what's more significant about it is because of what it means about Britain's policy stance on Ukraine, the Middle East and China. And yesterday was the initial shock of the announcement, and now we're actually having to think quite seriously about what this might mean for the shifting sands of our geopolitical position. Now, we don't have enough time today to talk through all of Lord Cameron, as he is now, previously stated positions on these subjects. But what I will say is during his time as PM, he was criticised for his handling on all 3 of the core issues I just mentioned, especially Syria and Libya in the Middle Eastern context, but also China, for whom Cameron sought to build stronger ties famously and said that it was a golden era, if I recall, for the relations between China and Britain. Now, on Ukraine specifically, he was Prime Minister when Crimea was annexed by Russia and was seen as following the Obama administration's line, which, as we've discussed many times, especially in the context of the full-scale invasion, was not seen as a particularly strong response, which may have contributed to the decision to invade last year. Interestingly though, in his first remarks to the media yesterday, the first issue that David Cameron raised as a priority was Ukraine. And regular listeners may recall that he actually volunteered and drove donated humanitarian supplies to Ukraine very early on in the war. So I think it's fair to say this is an issue that he is sensitive to and which he thinks matters very much. On the issue of supplies, though, it will be weapons that will remain front and centre in his new role. And on that subject, there have been some interesting developments in the US today, with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan of course, one of the most influential figures in the context of the war, saying it is getting harder every week for the US to fully support Ukraine amid the congressional opposition to new funding. So to quote him directly, each week that passes, our ability to fully fund what we feel is necessary to give Ukraine the tools and capabilities it needs to both defend its territory and continue to make advances gets harder and harder. For us, the window is closing. As we've covered, Republicans in Congress are stonewalling additional financial support for Ukraine as part of the most recent proposed budget. It's true politically to say that things are getting more difficult in an election context and the presidential election next year for the Democrats to support Ukraine as openly. I don't think it's controversial to say that. But I think it's important to remember financially, as Mitt Romney was keen to emphasise when we interviewed him for the podcast, this idea that this concept that the US military budget is being stretched and stressed by Ukraine is highly debatable. The US is using 5% in order to essentially destroy the capabilities of the Russian armed forces. That's a good deal, as he put it. So this is really about the Republican Party and its isolationism, rather than it being a matter of cost to the American taxpayer. It's more ideological as opposed to pragmatic, I think it would be fair to say. Brighter news within the EU context, though. Olaf Scholz, Germany's Chancellor, of course, governing coalition, has agreed in principle to doubling the country's military aid for Ukraine next year to 8 billion euros, according to reports. If approved by the Parliament, the boost would lift Germany's defence spending to 2.1% of its gross domestic product target, beyond, critically, the 2% pledged by all NATO members. So this would be finally a step into Germany actually paying what it's due to according to the NATO, as part of being a member of NATO. Lawmakers of Scholz's Social Democrats, the Free Democrats and the Green Party agreed on the increase in negotiations over the federal budget ahead of a full meeting of the Budget Committee. This is all coming out of Reuters, and Bloomberg News over the weekend first stated that this was a possibility. Now, of course, I think it is important to contextualise this. Germany has already been the major European contributor, Britain now in second. But for many, it has not undergone the Zeitenwende it pledged following the invasion, though Berlin has channeled more than 17 billion in military aid for Ukraine and, of course, the Leopard 2 tanks, amongst other things. But I think the concern here, which is why I'm adding in the caveat, is that we'll need to crunch the numbers quite carefully. Previous boosts in military spending in Germany and elsewhere have not allowed for inflation, thereby in real terms actually not being anywhere near as sizable as they initially appear. So just important to bear that in mind when we're talking about these huge upgrades in spending. The fact is that the EU will broadly miss its goal this year to supply Ukraine with 1 million rounds of ammunition, and that is coming from Germany and the Defence Minister Pistorius. He said it's safe to assume that those rounds will not be reached, and the bloc, of course, made that pledge back in March, saying it would meet the target within 12 months, but has not managed to do that. And Mr. Pistorius said that it was working with the arms industry to try and ramp up its own production, but didn't really offer a detailed explanation as to why there had been this failure. But Kyiv has been more forthcoming. They've blamed a lot of bureaucracy, to quote them. This is Foreign Minister Kuleba also speaking in Germany. He said the problems in the continent's defence industry have a lot of unsynchronised issues and a lot of bureaucracy, which is leading to these issues in supply. This has often been a criticism of the EU, that it's not adaptive at pace, as it were. So it won't come as a huge shock, but nonetheless will cause some frustration, I think. And just lastly, David, we learned today that Putin is planning to ditch the political party that he leads and run as an independent candidate in the Russian presidential election to boost his wartime leader credentials. Quite an interesting story, this one. We'll need to speculate on more deeply, I think, another time. He stood as an independent in 2018, and it was believed that he would stand for the United Russia Party again next year, as he did in 2012. But it would appear that he's now keen to stand as himself as opposed to standing with these particular political figures. There are lots of reasons for that being speculated, which I won't go into now, but some of it is around issues around the war in Ukraine and the scepticism within some of the political entities within the United Russia Party. Now, on top of this announcement, Putin has approved new restrictions on journalists ahead of the elections. Only journalists contracted to registered media outlets will be allowed to cover the election commission meetings in a move that would probably bar a lot of freelancers and independent journalists. This is coming from the Associated Press. Coverage of the commission has also been banned on military bases and areas under martial law. So more evidence of the shifts in Russian society prepare for this said election, which of course we have to mean in the loosest possible sense of the term. But it does seem that we are going to see a presidential election being run in Russia, one that will see more of Putin talking about the war and seemingly designed to try and stop awkward questions around the conflict in Ukraine. So that's where we are, David. Just one final thing I'll say is there has, of course, been this quite significant piece by the Washington Post talking about Nord Stream published this week. I think we need to digest its findings a little bit more deeply before we talk about that, but we're on the case and we'll cover it this week.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that. Hey, Mr. Breton-Gordon, can I come to you? There's quite a few subjects I know you would like to talk us through, from low-cloud precision weapons to the power situation in Ukraine and the grid, and more generally about the Ukraine conflict and UK security in relation to Israel-Gaza. Where would you like to start?
Good afternoon, everybody. David, Francis, thanks very much for that. Well, I'd just like to start really with the state of the conflict and the importance to UK and European security. Despite the horrific pictures and narrative coming out of Gaza, the state of the war in Ukraine has, I would suggest, much greater significance for the future security and prosperity of the UK and Europe than what is happening in the Middle East. As we remember the dead of the past world wars and conflicts, it's the prospect of nuclear war heading ever westwards that requires our undivided military, diplomatic and political attention and support. Hamas and other Middle Eastern terror groups will threaten us with attack, no doubt, but it will be limited and does not have the potential to create a nuclear holocaust or tyrannical subjugation as Putin would likely try. So what? Well, what I'm really looking at here, and we discussed the essay by the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukraine Armed Forces, Modern Positional Warfare and How to Win It, last week. And I think there's some key things that we need to consider from it. A wiser person than me said there's nothing new, there's just stuff we've forgotten. In general terms, this is correct. But when one looks at it from the 5 areas of importance to this war, from the general's perspective, there is variance to this epitaph. Firstly, in the air power, the defining capability since the First World War for the determinants and application of successful ground power. In essence, Russia's air superiority has kept them in the fight. Had Ukraine had modern Western jets like F-16s, would Russia have been able to push so rapidly south and east in the early part of the war? Will the F-16s be one of the key technological advantages that the general suggests Ukraine needs to break the deadlock, a key tenet of his paper? We'll soon find out. Secondly, on minefields, mine warfare, the second point of inflection, creating and enforcing this positional warfare. The science is to channel forces, but in extreme circumstances, if deep enough, to stop them. And that's exactly what we've seen in southern and eastern Ukraine. The technology to break through them is still really First World War. So what is the technology advance that will open these lanes quickly without having to put a very slow-moving plough through it? Something electronic, perhaps, or from my experiences in the first Gulf War, huge thermobaric bombs to blow the mines to pieces. I just wonder where these weapons are. The scale and the level of artillery exchanges are on the face of it not unlike the Western Front of 1915, with Russia in particularly appearing to fire thousands of rounds a day. The technology to defeat this appears to be counter-battery fire, enabled by drones. Artillery was thought of an area weapon, but drones are making them precise, as we discussed at the beginning of the podcast. by recording fall of shot and allow immediate corrections. But countering this new way of fire is more and more electronic countermeasures, and the race to stay ahead are sort of akin to mobile phone manufacturers fighting for business by ever better technology. I think nobody in the 21st century thought pure numbers of soldiers would be as important as they were at the turn of the 20th century. Russia reportedly has lost 300,000 soldiers in the 20 months of this war. But the positional warfare allows Russia to keep pouring barely trained soldiers into the trenches who only need to hold a gun and fire a gun. Ukraine, on the other hand, doesn't have enough safe training areas for recruits, and I believe the general is politely screaming at the West to do some of the heavy lifting in this area. The final overarching thing is about new technology to shift the needle. In 1915, it was chlorine gas which moved the front line significantly, and in 1917, it was a tank. At the time, we did not realise their potential, as they were used piecemeal and not part of a comprehensive and combined arms approach. God forbid if gas becomes a thing again, but I have quoted in other essays that if you have no morals or scruples, you'd use chemical weapons all the time, as they're morbidly brilliant weapons. And after the nerve agent attack in Salisbury 5 years ago, we know the Russians have these weapons. So Ukraine must be on its guard if they're used to break the stalemate. As a tank commander, I gauge the tank action at Cambrai in 1917 is no different to the tank action in 2023 in the Donbass. But will it break the stalemate if the other wants of this essay are produced? Surely the technical advantage to break the stalemate will come from AI and deep internet developed by somebody with a laptop rather than a gun. But that is to forego the epitaph that there is nothing new. And just in conclusion to my piece here, we talk about the technology. And you were mentioning earlier, David, about Russia going for more precision and technicality, especially as the weather closes in. And it reminds me of a battlefield tour, or staff ride, as we call it, that I attended in 2008. And this is where you rehearse a battle on the tabletop, if you like, but you actually go out to the field to do it. This battle was a NATO-sponsored event, actually sponsored by the then Chief of the General Staff, Sir Richard Dannett, and it was to fight the Cold War from Berlin back to the Channel. And it included lots of senior British generals, American generals, lots of Ukraine generals, and even some Russian generals. I was there as a mere colonel at the time, as the intelligence and surveillance expert to comment on generals' plans. And one defence, I think there's a Sebessa Gap to the west of Berlin, one British general, and I won't name who he is, produced his plan to all the generals surrounding. And it was based on drones and surveillance assets in the sky, providing the intelligence to cue tanks and artillery onto the advancing Russians. And General Dannett asked me for my comment. I looked willfully at the sky, and it was one of those classic German November days with the clouds hanging just on top of the trees. I'd recently returned from Afghanistan, and my one comment was, I expect the general and I are too used to the clear blue skies of Afghanistan and Iraq to come up with comprehensive surveillance plans when the clouds are down. And I think this is a really important piece that the MOD briefing is alluding to today. It's all very well having the precision weapons and great technology, but actually we yet have the power to see through cloud. The only slight adjunct to that I'd say is, with these tiny drones that can fly 2 or 3 feet off the ground, that might change it in certain areas. But fundamentally, the weather still has a significant role to play.
Well, thank you so much for all of that, Hamish. Can we talk about one more thing before we move to summing up today? And that's just to talk a little bit about the power situation in Ukraine. President Zelensky has already said that the country is sadly expecting huge waves of attacks on the grid, as we saw last winter, as Russia essentially attempts to freeze the Ukrainians out of the war. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think this is an area that we are going to be talking about a lot more over the next few weeks and months. As we understand, as the weather starts to break and the requirement for additional power and heat goes higher and higher. And we look at the last winter and the way that Russia attacked, not only the power stations, but the infrastructure to do it. What one is expecting to see that more and more, and with more precision guided weapons available to the Russians, then that is going to become more of a challenge. Again, without wanting to frighten the horses, this winter is going to be slightly different because a lot more of that power is coming from nuclear, with 3 nuclear power plants being turned back on this winter. Yeah, let's hope that the Russians decide to, if they are going to prosecute this type of action, which we're sure they will, that they focus on the distribution network rather than actually directly attacking those power stations. We've done a lot of work with people that I advise in the area how to keep themselves safe. And these nuclear power plants are not like Chernobyl. They are not likely to create some massive nuclear explosion and event. But having said that, the chance for contamination, so in the local areas up to a couple of 100 kilometres, is going to be significantly high. And one hopes that the air defence is good enough to make sure that direct hits on these facilities are avoided, which is why, going back to one of your very early points with a new foreign secretary coming into play and the requirement to keep things going, my point about the Ukraine conflict having a more direct physical application to the security of this country is something that I hope that Lord Cameron will bear in mind and make sure that Ukraine has as much air defence, has as much ammunition and the wherewithal to be able to withstand this and hopefully make progress. But I am concerned, as I'm sure everybody is in Ukraine, on the impending or the likelihood of a significant attack on the power grid over the next few weeks.
If I could just jump in there, David, and pick up on something that Hamish was saying there. I agree it's a concern, although I think it is also important to stress that a lot of work has been done in the past year in order to prepare for this winter. Obviously, we weren't sure if the war would still be going on, but in all likelihood it would be. And so there has been a lot of work from Ukraine's allies in providing defence mechanisms, which Hamish just described there, that will ensure that strikes are not as effective as they were in that first terrible winter, where it was a huge challenge for Ukraine to absorb the attacks it was taking on its energy infrastructure. And we reported on numerous power outages as a result. And it is worth bearing in mind, of course, and I know we emphasise this as often as we can, but it is always worth repeating, when you attack directly civilian infrastructure, it is a war crime. When it is your deliberate target to take out civilian infrastructure, that is unacceptable under international law. So we can say irrefutably that those strikes that we saw last year, which were designed to knock out the power grid in Kyiv, and thereby, of course, you're taking out energy in people's homes, in hospitals, in civic centres, then that is against the rules-based order, which we reference so many times. And it's another example of the ways in which in Ukraine we are, in a sense, trying to maintain that these things are not acceptable. And so if Russia is allowed to get away with any kind of concession or success on the battlefield, then it is worth bearing in mind that you are, as I was saying last week, effectively sanctioning, permitting certain things. And that includes war crimes. It includes the kidnapping of children. It includes the attacks on civilian infrastructure. And so, as I say, to those who are at the moment saying this war just needs to end, that it's gone on for long enough, it's so terrible, the Ukrainians don't feel that way because they feel that this is something that they have every right to define what victory looks like for them. The international community has agreed with that, or at least as far as the Western powers are concerned. And the Ukrainians are also very sensitive to the fact, and have been saying this ever since the beginning, that if you were to mandate the kind of activity that Russia has been able to get away with in Ukraine, then you are essentially threatening the way in which wars are conducted for the years ahead. And as we've talked about many times, this is going to be a very, very unstable period. So there's a lot at stake. But I just think it's worth bearing that in mind in the context of the energy structure. A lot of work has been done, and it will be interesting to see the degree to which that actually does reduce the impact of the strikes on Ukrainian cities in the weeks ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and Hamish. Let's move to our final thoughts. Hamish, can I come to you first? I'd be interested to hear from you what you think is almost one of the most... You've made so many really good and interesting points today. Which would you want our listeners to go away and really consider?
Well, thank you. I know it's a hugely challenging time for everybody with so much happening around the place and so many horrific sort of sights again coming out of the Middle East, and something very close to my heart. And in fact, I've another piece I've written for the paper, which will be up today, about attacking hospitals and using hospitals in warfare, which I saw personally in Syria, we've seen in Ukraine, and now we're seeing in Gaza. But all these horrific things are happening, and absolutely emphasize what Francis had been saying here. We mustn't let the activities of Hamas and the Russians and others really cloud our view and vision of the future, because ultimately we must stand up for the rules-based order, and we must stand up for peace. And if we capitulate or take our eye off a particular ball, then we will not be doing that. But I do, as really my piece at the beginning, we must not, it might not be on the front lines. There might not be thousands of people shouting and screaming about it in the streets of London every Saturday. But the war in Ukraine, which is now into its 21st month, really has the potential to completely change the whole picture of Europe and the whole way of our life if we do not make sure that we provide Ukraine with everything to prevail, to come to a position where the Russians are vanquished and Ukraine is back to a peaceful country. If we fail in that, then quite frankly, everything else, however desperate and dreadful at the moment, will become horrifically irrelevant.
Thank you very much, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Francis Sternley, would you like the final words for today?
Well, thanks, David. We've spoken many times on the podcast about this issue of Putin's stability in the Russian context. And you can measure that by, of course, many different metrics. And we've tried to do that. We've discussed that on numerous occasions. But interestingly, the Center for American Security have actually produced a Russia stability tracker. And it's a website where they essentially identify the core pillars of Putin's stability, things such as the absence of an alternative to him, cohesive political and economic elite, control over the information environment, and then judge exactly how vulnerable or not Putin is at the present moment. So it's constantly adapting based on more information. And it's very interesting. So the areas in which they think Putin's position is weakening is on the cohesive political and economic elite, and they believe that is eroding stability for Putin in the country. The exit of the most discontented, so those who are leaving the country on mass numbers, which Dom spoke about last week, and also the repression as well, and the feeling of the ramping up of oppression is also not necessarily causing Russia to become stable. And yet, the other areas where things are in a sense supporting stability, areas like control over the information environment, an apolitical military, loyal security services, Putin's popularity, these things are remaining fairly consistent. And there's a lot more information under each, but you can see why they've reached the conclusions that they've reached. But I think this is a very interesting tool, first of all, but I also think it gets to the essence of what we really need to be thinking about here, which is, I think this war only ends with Russia's defeat if Putin is really threatened at home. And I don't necessarily mean threatened in terms of being usurped, but I mean the pressure on him is significant enough that he reaches the decision that it is time for him to pull out and stabilise matters at home. And so I think really the importance of this is asking the right questions. as opposed to whether you agree with every single bullet point in terms of their analysis. These are the questions to be asked, and breaking it down in terms of those central pillars. So I hope that people in our intelligence services and politics around Europe and the world are thinking in these terms, because I think it's a very helpful tool. So I'll be sure to add a link to that in the description for the episode.
Thank you, Francis and Hamish. Last week, I had the pleasure of speaking to Ukrainian journalist Inna Gadzynska. Inna recently published a huge and detailed piece of work looking at how thousands upon thousands of precious Ukrainian archaeological objects have, over the previous centuries, made their way to Russian museums. Here's our conversation. Inna, thank you so much for your time. Before we go into my questions, would you start just by introducing yourself to our listeners?
I'm a journalist and editor. I come to online and data journalism from traditional journalism. I had been working in Kiev in daily newspaper as an editor. It is quite a stressful experience. If people who had been working in printed media, they know how it is, this experience. Now I'm working in the Ukrainian data journalism agency, Text.org.ua. It is a very small newsroom, but very effective. We are doing a lot of data stories about Ukrainian war after the war started, based on satellite maps, open data. We are looking for information. We have a big experience investigating Russian disinformation in Russian media and Ukrainian media, with in help with algorithms. And I've joined this team a few years ago, and I'm very happy to get new experience from traditional journalism to data journalism to some using modern algorithms and modern ways to reach the audience.
Thank you very much for that intro, Inna. Let's talk about one rather spectacular piece of data journalism you've produced and you worked on. It looks at treasures and historical objects from Ukraine that are not on display in Ukraine, but they're actually on display in Russia. Can you tell us about this story? Why did you want to look at this subject, and how did you go about it?
In fact, this story had been started for me in before the full-scale war in November 2021. When I was looking internet for some other stories, I've been working before with historical topics on Ukrainian history. And I found a very interesting monograph of Ukrainian historian Serhiy Kort. And it was quite big, 900 pages work about restitution issues. And it was dedicated to the Ukrainian history, and in very special details, the author explained how Ukraine had been losing our cultural treasures, our values, and what was the role of Russia in this process. Because Ukraine for hundreds of years was part of Russian Empire, after for 70 years was part of Soviet, as we say, empire. And what was going on during this time. And it was a lot of examples in this book. And it was quite interesting. And I started to work on this book with an idea to create some project about this. But after, in February, Gray's full-scale war started. And of course, this topic somehow went to behind. And I turned back to this topic in April 23 with new inputs. Because till that time, we knew already about museums in Mariupol, in Kherson, which were robbed. A lot of canvases, icons, old prints, which were stolen in Berdyansk, Mariupol, Kherson. And in fact, I come back to this topic trying to understand if we will be able to find something from this new stolen by Russian army in Russian museums. And we started to investigate the database, open data of Russian museums. There is one big piece of open data that it is published outside, and it includes 870 Russian museums, and I don't know, maybe 100 millions of exhibits there. But it was not informative, because we understood that many markers which can talk about Ukrainian origin of things are not visible there, are not filled some fields. So we stepped back and started to investigate databases of two biggest museums. And it is the National Historical Museum of Russia and Hermitage in St. Petersburg. Why these two museums? Because as I have read in this monograph and in other historical books, these museums were the main museums where the most valuable things from Ukraine, which were found, had been sent. We started to investigate this database, but unfortunately, or I don't know, but we couldn't find any new valuable artifacts which were registered after 2024. There was first thing. Another thing, in fact, we didn't know what we are looking for, because there is, as far as I know, in publicity, there is no published list what had been stolen in different museums. I know that Ukrainian prosecutor's office has this list, at least from one of museum, from Kherson Museum, and they are dealing with this. But there is no this list on public, and you don't know what you are looking for. It is very difficult to find something. Also, Russians in their databases, if they have opportunity not to write origin, they are not writing. For example, they are writing canvas of Ivazovsky, and they can write only city, or they can write Russia, and it's very difficult to find. So this our story that we did together with my colleagues who can use algorithms, who are more experienced in data journalism, it is the attempt, in fact, to comprehend and to summarize what we have in total, how many Ukrainian finds are in Russian museums. But the topic is so huge, and it is impossible to collect in one story, especially when there is measurable deadlines, there is some limited resources. So we decided to concentrate only on archaeological finds. And the main reason why, that in archaeological finds, they are writing their place of origin and archaeological site. And as I have consulted with Ukrainian historians, it is enough, this marker enough to say that this find belongs to Ukraine. It was brought from Ukraine. We know this. Because, there are a lot of antique things which had been taken from Crimea, but there is no Crimean description. It was made by some Rome Empire somewhere, and you cannot prove that it is from Crimea. That's why there is archaeological finds. That's why there are two museums, and like this. And I have some more ideas how to develop this story later, but now I'm looking for additional data.
So you've been, just to sum up, you looked through the database, the archaeological database of two major Russian museums to track what finds and objects and artifacts had been taken over the years. So this isn't just in the past 2 years, it's in the past 200 years, 300 years, longer, from the geographical area of modern Ukraine to the geographical area of modern Russia to these museums. Could you tell us a bit more about these artifacts and these archaeological objects? Which are the most interesting, the most special to you when you were looking through this story?
There are more than 100,000 of them, and many of them are valuable just for archaeologists because it is some parts of ceramics or something. And for average people, it is like, okay, I don't need this part of ceramic, take it, it is yours. But from remarkable things, there are very big and rich collection of Scythian gold from ancient tombs, which were 3-4 centuries before BC, which were found in Ukrainian area. There was a very big collection of antique values from antique cities from Crimea. Also, there is a very big group of values is some things from period of Middle Age Rus country. I know that now they say Kievan Rus, but Kievan Rus, as historians say, is not proved historically. It is ancient Rus, and there are a lot of icons, old prints. We made a special database for old prints. It is important for Russia, also important these artifacts, because now modern Russia is trying to prove that ancient Kievan Rus and Rus country was Russia, in fact. In fact, they are still in Ukrainian history in such a way. So these artifacts, icon, some religious things from Ukrainian churches are very important, symbolical for Ukraine. But it is also important for us because it is part of our history. Orthodox really are taken, and after they are bringing to their churches. And there is a very remarkable story about one icon of Saint Vladimir. Now it is one of the main Orthodox relics in Russia. But this icon was stolen from Vyshgorod. It is Ukrainian city near Kiev, not big town, in fact, and was stolen in 19th century. And it is a remarkable story which shows how it is all these things work. In fact, in our story, it is we mostly things which were taken from Ukraine to Russia from 18th, 19th, and 20th century.
Could we talk a little bit here about the process? How did these objects and artifacts move to Russia? Who's taking them? And you've touched on it before, but it'd be good to hear a bit more on your views as to why this is happening in the first place.
We found three main ways how these Ukrainian cultural values were taken to Russia. First thing, of course, when Ukraine was under Russian Empire, in 18th century, Russia created museum Hermitage and created an archaeological commission in all parts of empire. And this commission was responsible for taking the most valuable things from all provinces to the center. And in such a way, the most valuable things from Ukraine finds were taken to Russia. It is one very big channel, let's say, very big period. Another big period when Russia took a lot of valuable things from Ukraine, it was early Soviet time, just after Soviet Revolution, because the Soviet Union, which just appeared, needed currency, needed money. And they collected the most valuable things from Ukrainian museum, from local museum, from collection. And many of them were melted down and sold. And some of them left in Russian museums. It was another very big flow. After, in 1930s, there was period when they were robbing Ukrainian churches. And they took many valuable things from Ukrainian churches. The next story was the Second World War. After the Nazis stolen many things from Ukrainian museums and brought to Germany. And after there was process very big restitution. But in the result of this restitution, many things come back, but to Moscow museums, to St. Petersburg, to Russian museums. Some of them were given back, but in fact they didn't want to do this. It was very problematic. During Soviet time, there was another story. During Soviet time, Russian museums very often were creating exhibitions. And for this exhibition, they were asking exhibits from Kiev museums, from Ukrainian museums, and not always they were given back. And also there are, of course, some ways when people just were leaving from Ukraine, leaving from Kiev, going to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, and they had some collections, and they were just bringing these collections with them after these people died, and their collection left in Russia. It is more or less peaceful way. Of course, there were different earlier in 18th century when Cossack siege were destroyed by Russians. It was just robbing, just like now. Army just destroyed city Baturin, took collection of Cossacks' weapons, all ancient books, old prints, icons, everything. All these things are in Russian museums. Some of them come back, but very less. Still a lot, like this.
You've used the word restitution, so the process of returning these objects, a few times in our conversation. Currently, what's the possibility, legally or otherwise, of returning some or any of these objects? And it'd be interesting maybe to hear a little bit more about the restitution movement in Ukraine. What does this campaign look like to get these objects back, and what do you think the future of that is?
As far as I know, there is on public space, there is no any restitution campaign on Ukraine. But it is normal because now there is war. And until war will be finished, there is nothing to talk about. And all talks are considered like some populism, that why you are talking about people dying, what you are talking about. But as I know, there are only criminal cases. Now it is criminal cases, and the prosecutor's office investigating as a criminal cases. What had been stolen, how it can be come back. But this story only about things which had been taken by Russian army in Ukrainian museums from 2022. As for archaeological finds, for example, that I described in our story, all of them had been taken before Ukraine gained independence. Of course, legally, now there is no any chance to be given back. We also understand it. But why I think that to publish this story was important? Because it is wide talk about colonialism, about how it affects countries. We should declare that there are a lot of things from our history, big part of our history is there. It is taken by Russia. Even now, frankly, I think it will be extremely difficult to take it back. But, Ukrainians are changing rules sometimes. So I hope that this story also can be part of, because in world history now they are talking about anti-colonialism. They are talking about returning things to place of their origin. Only in this context it can be possible, because Russians are not going to give something back just voluntarily. It is clear. Now they started to hide all these artifacts. So I don't know. But about history of restitution, there was such attempt. And in fact, Ukraine in 90s was very close to return back some most valuable things. There were, in 1992 or 1991, there was some commission, Ukrainian, Russian, and they agreed even what should be turned back. There was a list. Now I'm trying to find this list because there is no in public space. And Russia signed this document that they will give back, but after started very big scandal, and they refused. And they just refused, and this story closed, because it was not only about Ukraine and Russia. And this, it is wider talk. We have a lot of Central Asian republics and Central Asian treasures that also in Russian museums. I think this talk is very important. Also, there is no now any legal way to take it back. It should be in public space, this topic. We should know this. The modern story about what was after 2022. This story is there are different situations in different museums. The most dramatic, I think, is Mariupol museums, because it was destroyed and all collection was lost. It is Russia took it, but we don't know where it is. It is more than 2,000 things, some 600 canvases, ancient icons, old prints. Berdyansk collection was just dropped. Berdyansk museum, there was Ivazovsky there. But Kherson museum, also dramatical story, they lost almost 11,000 items. It was the richest collection of canvases from local museums, if we are not counting Kiev. And they identified 60 canvases in Central Crimea Museum in Simferopol. But the most valuable things made by Vrubel, they don't know where it is. It is not appeared anywhere. Nobody knows where they are. And I know that they are looking for in prosecutor's office, but no news. This Crimea is different story. They just registering all Crimea's museums in Russian online registries as they are. As I say, they just stolen museums together with exhibits. And all of them, that it is registered. There are more than 500,000 exhibits already registered.
Inna, this is a really fascinating conversation. Before we end, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear about your story, about your work, about the story of Ukrainian artifacts and objects making their way to Russia and often not coming back?
Very important thing that we should pay attention, that Russians started to create historical myth about, as they say, Northern Black Sea region, Novorossiya. And they are writing the history of this region separate from Ukraine, starting from 18th century. And main Russian museums, like Hermitage and Historical Museum especially, they are helping them in this. Because you can see, if you open site of Russian Historical Museum, they are announcing big exhibition Novorossiya. In this exhibition Novorossiya, they collected all artifacts mixed, that new taken, old taken, and they are showing like history of Novorussia. And this history includes a part of Russian Empire, of Soviet Union, and new occupied time. They just deleted Ukrainian part of these lands. And what is very important, they are writing that they are making expedition and collecting new artifacts in Luhansk region, in new occupied areas. And I think it is a reason to talk about some place of these Russian museums in the world museums community, because they are declaring that they are taking part in some scientific search in occupied areas. But we are very sorry, it is not scientific search. It is war, and it is called in another words. And I think the world community could pay some attention on this.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.